Everybody, welcome to the third webinar of the Hawk Symposium Week webinar series. Again, we acknowledge the sponsorship from Standard Bank for all three events. Yesterday, we heard about climate change from Prof. Stephanie Mitchley and how it might affect us in the future in terms of deciduous fruit production. And Prof. Mitchley said that one of the key mitigation options that we've got as producers in the deciduous industry is nets. So today, the subject of the webinar will be nets. We'll be looking at what we can expect in terms of nets. We can look at the advantages, the disadvantages, and we'll also look at structures. So I'm very privileged today to have three guests. To my right, first of all, is Willie Kotze. He's the Pome Fruit Technical Advisor at the Toy Agri, and in that sense, very much involved with efforts in their group with netting. He's also currently the chair of the Fieldman Association, serves on various Hawk research and technical work groups, where he is one of the people who make major contributions in terms of deciding what research our industry should be doing, including looking at nets. To his left is Day3 du Plessis. Day3 is a stone fruit producer, he's a technical advisor, he's a shareholder in a company involved in marketing of stone fruit. He's the Hawk representative for the Stellenbosch region and surrounds. And over and above that, he's a self-professed plum enthusiast who decided to put his farm under nets. He's also wearing a lot of hats. And then to Day3's left is Koos Bouwer. Koos is an industrial engineer, whereas the other two gentlemen are horticulturists. He bucks a trend a little bit today, and he'll be talking to us about the structures in a bit more detail. So Koos is no stranger to our industry. He's been involved in numerous projects over time in terms of efficiency, packhouse solutions, etc. He works for the company For Engineering Solutions. Prior to that, while he was conducting this particular study, he'll be providing background on today or feedback on today. He used to work for NDP. So Koos was a leader, and I already alluded to it, of a project funded by Hawk, CRI, and Carp Agri looking at net structures. And the aim was to develop a best practice guideline for net structures. Okay, so those are the guests. And before we embark on asking a couple of questions, just a few householding rules. Please keep your microphones muted and your microphone and your video cameras off. There will be opportunity for questions right at the end of the webinar. You are welcome to type any questions you might have into the comment box or the chat box, and we'll get around to it at the end of the webinar. Just a final bit of information or comment. We are experiencing load shedding at the moment in Stellenbosch. The building we're in does have a generator, so we're good for electricity. But if we go a little bit over time potentially, which might happen because we've got a lot of field to cover today, and I think it'll be interesting, so I don't want to stop things short. But if we do go a little bit over time and electricity comes back on, there might be a short interruption in our power supply. And what I suggest is that you just then get up, get yourself a coffee, and 5 minutes later join us again. And we should be back online. Okay, so without further ado, we'll kick off the questions, and I'll ask my first question of Day3. Day3, what were the main reasons, I've already alluded to it, that you put your farm on nets, and most people driving it past Stellenbosch can see it from the road. What's the reason why you put your farm under nets, your plums? And what would be other the general considerations why plum farmers might consider putting their plums under nets?
Good morning, Vian, and also our colleagues back home. Thanks for the question. Yeah, for the people that don't know, I'm from Stellenbosch. I'm a stone fruit farmer, so I'm farming, and I think before we get into technical, when I studied horticulture, I also had a sort of an economical angle on that, and that is that I'm using nets to improve the profitability of the orchards. So before we go to the technical aspects in terms of color of nets and the shade percentage and this and that, it's a huge investment capital investment to plant the orchard. And the nets are actually in our area where we where we experience a lot of wind, is that it's almost an insurance policy in terms of all the inputs that we're doing over all the years, is that we almost ensure that the fruit that we produce it's been optimized, and also all the processes that's going along with it. So in my area and under my circumstances, it's about wind, because most of you guys have studied at Stellenbosch, or you know Stellenbosch, if you've been in Stellenbosch when the southeast is blowing. In summertime, there's a hectic lot of wind, so I put nets up to improve my my fruit size and my class 1 pack-out percentage. Some other producers in other areas can maybe use nets for other reasons, maybe for preventing of sunburn or this and that, but at least on my side, it was about wind damage and about optimizing the whole fruit growing process.
So Petri, what color nets, tell us a bit more about the nets that you put up, put on.
I think if we look at stone fruit, because Vali must comment on what's happening in the plum fruit industry, but if we talk about peaches, nectarines and plums, the color of nets, it's actually less of importance than let's say, for instance, in plum. So I'm almost of the opinion, and if you ask also different specialists, they're all going to have their own opinion, but I'm almost of the opinion, put a color of net which is complementing the area. I would say a crystal net, 20%, they talk about class 20, so 20% net is removing 20% UV and giving about 6 or 7% shade. But in terms of color, the color is not that important. White net, grey net, you get a crystal blue net, that's all going quite well. So there's very little interference in terms of the color of the fruit and also the brick percentage. So in terms of color of net, it's less important than the class of the net. And class of the net, there's a direct relation in terms of the amount of UV that's been removed and also the shade percentage. On my side in Stellenbosch, it's quite important not to lower the bricks content of the fruit. So it was very important for me to block the wind, and I've got a class 20 net, which means I'm removing 20% UV with 6% shade. I'm blocking about 50% of wind speed. So if my weather forecast is saying we're expecting 9 meters per second or 10 meters per second wind speed, that's really damaging my crop, cosmetic marks and even blind fruit from the trees. The nets is calming down the wind to about 5 meters per second. At 4 to 5 meters per second, my plums are happy.
So you basically just want the physical barrier, and therefore, you know, the lightest shading factor, but just so not to affect other aspects, but just the barrier. And I guess Koos will later on tell us how on preventing that your net doesn't end up at Elsenburg. It becomes a sale.
Exactly.
Yes. Okay, so you've already alluded to that in palm fruit things might be a bit different. Now, Valia's got experience of both palm and stone. With the TUI group, of course, you farm various fruit types really in very different areas. What's the netting strategy within your group? I mean, when you consider what you will net and where you will net, what are you looking at?
Okay, so good morning everybody. Jan. I'm involved with both palm and stone. I prefer to keep it to the palm fruit for now, but yeah, we've got 2 main production areas, which is the Landkloof and then the Koubokkerveld. In the Landkloof, we've got stone fruit, mainly plums under net, and apples, and both of those are primarily under net for the risk of ice rain, sleet and hail. But then also the apple, even though it's close to the coast, you do get 1 or 2 odd days, which damages the crop. And then in the Koubokkerveld, it's primarily some cherries we put under nets for hail, and apples mostly for hail and sunburn as well. So it's something that we were not used to get hail. But if you take the track record of the last 6-7 years, it's becoming a complete different story. So it's mainly to protect the crop against those 2 damaging factors on the apples.
Pietri, your net is a fixed net, and is it retractable? Can it open up? Or is yours a net that stays in place the entire season?
I think I made mistakes along the way. So I started off 3-4 years ago with a fixed, as we call in Afrikaans, platak structure. So it's a fixed structure that in the past couldn't open. I've changed it. It wasn't expensive, but it was quite easy to change that we can open it up. And we learned over the years it's actually better for a lot of things to open up a little bit. It's better for the development of the flower buds and also for bees and pollination. But in my view, there's a little bit of a difference in terms of in the stone fruit category. If we talk about peaches, nectarines, which is self-pollinating, I think Koos can almost recommend a lower structure because you don't need that extra height above the trees for pollination, for bees. So for peaches, nectarines, I'm totally happy with a fixed structure. With plums, I'm feeling every year more adamant that the structure must open and close. So I've adapted my system that we can open after the harvest. We can expose the trees to full sun. It's been exposed through the whole winter period, and we allow the pollination to be, the trees to be pollinated, and then just after the pollination period, we close again. And I must say, as a stone fruit producer, I'm feeling very happy after the pollination period. Basically, all the plums that's been pollinated or successfully pollinated and set after September, I can get almost all of those plums in a class 1 carton. And that's, to me, it's very, very nice. I can sleep at night, especially if the southeaster starting to howl for 2-3 days. It's really a nice thing to have.
Yeah, so the risk management tool.
Exactly.
Vali, in your case, flat nets, nets that's retractable. What are you guys looking at? I guess it also depends on the situation.
Yeah, I must say we started off with mostly flat roofs. Then there was a time period where we started looking at the European type of styles of net that was able to open and close. A lot of thought went into the effect that wind will have on the loose structure and everything. And yeah, so we've come up with quite a few of our own designs in the meantime. But at this stage, we're putting up something that can open and close. We've got 1 or 2 areas where snow is not an issue, that we still do flat roofs. But in most of the situations, we do put up something that can open and close. In the Landkloof, we also do it for a little bit of the ability to have some light on the crop and to have the option of opening and closing if pollination does become an issue. And in the Koabokkenveld, it's not an option. If you get snow and nets don't go together too well, so there we don't really have that much of an issue or option. We have to be able to open and close. So that brings us to a European type of system that can open and close.
In terms of the success so far with nets, how would you describe it in terms of what are your results to date? If one look at the positives of nets.
If you only look at apples at this stage, I'll start off with the young trees. So just in terms of growth, we do see a little bit better performance of the trees under nets. We tend to fill the canopy volume a little bit quicker. The trees are very happy under the nets, the leaders grow well. And then in terms of back out, I think that was one of the major issues that we had. We were reluctant to move to a more dwarfing rootstock because we didn't have a lot of experience with that, but we also wanted the nets. And in the last few years, we've baffled the lines with the different rootstock and the growth of the different side varieties. And sometimes we might have leaned a little bit more towards the a bit more vigorous rootstock. But all in all, still we were able to improve the backouts. And the main concern was color, in bicolors mostly. That's where we saw we see the biggest takeoff. And we do get, if we stick to the horticultural practices, we do get better backouts under the net. And we end up with more of the colored fruit actually ending up in an export garden instead of ending up in a local order juice bin because of marks and sunburn. So
yeah, because that sounds, I'm going to follow up on that. It sounds counterintuitive because we know that nets reduce light. We know that we require light for color development, more so in perm than in stone. And yet you say with nets you get better backouts of the blush varieties.
Yeah.
So can you allude it, so and that's due to not losing fruit to other things?
Yeah, especially with the newest plantings we have for the toy group. I know there's a lot of other growers which cover up existing orchards, especially in hill-prone areas like the Langkloof, where you, or in the Witzenberg, where you don't really have the luxury of farming without the net, just because hail is just too devastating. So there it's going to remain a little bit of a challenge to keep the tree in balance and with cropping and growth and color especially. So you taught us that graph where you have a tree and some part of the tree, especially if you go to dwarfing type, some part of the tree, or if you have a normal tree, a certain percentage of the tree is overexposed to light, certain percentage is well exposed, and then there's a shaded area. And if you go to the narrow tree canopies, you tend to have a part of the tree that's more overexposed. So a larger percentage of the tree is overexposed, so that can result in sunburn. And we've seen it with some of the dwarfing rootstocks or more dwarfing rootstocks. Even the M7s, is you tend to end up with branches that's not in a fixed position anymore. They do tend to move as the season progresses. So sunburn does become an issue. So, and it's always the well-exposed fruit on the outside with the good color that you tend to lose to sunburn. And just getting that fruit into a carton makes a big difference. And yeah, opening the trees up and having such a narrow canopy or open canopy compared to the conventional systems, that gives you the opportunity to get the color development. So,
do you combine it then also with other technology to try and improve the red color?
Yes, we do. We've only been doing it for the last 2 or 3 seasons, and we do see improvements. But even without that, if I can take something like leaf stripping or leaf removal to get block color on some varieties. If you do that under nets without even reflective mulching, you still get a massive improvement, and you don't lose any fruit to sunburn or close to no fruit you lose to sunburn. And if you look at defoliation machines and stuff like that, we know that they will work more towards the outside of the tree and not the inner canopy. So you're exposing a lot of your fruit to the potential of sunburn or sunburn bleaching, and that might end up in a class 3 carton or in the juice bins.
I haven't asked you about the color of the nets, but really I would guess just like the case of pear tree, where it's just about hail protection, you probably also go for the lightest shading factor. And I guess then with something like Grangesmith, you might go a little bit, with a little bit more shade.
Yeah, we haven't really dwelled into the different colors, especially if you get to the blues and the reds. Our experience so far has been with on apples has been mostly with white and grey. And I must say some of the varieties that we thought might color up a little bit more difficult. We're even improving just because of the open canopies and the sunburn. We still don't struggle with the color that much compared to sunburn, so we might end up with 1 or 2 shades darker than what we started off with the pear and white. So on the apples, we didn't really do any crystal, but I've seen some orchards in the industry where they covered existing orchards with crystal for the same reason. But yeah, even in the very narrow canopies, we are moving towards a little bit higher shade percentage.
Pietri, back to you now. What kind of gains have you experienced, in terms of pack out? One's interested in terms of, so the net is obviously expensive, and you go put up the net and you protect your crop against wind, but is it financially worth it? In terms of the better pack out that you get. And I mean, you'd also like to know whether your crop load is the same. You still get the same, you still get the fruit on the tree, because of plants one would be a bit worried about pollination, although you indicated that it's not the big issue for you. But one would worry about that, and some people might say that shading might have a negative effect on fruit size. What's been your experiences?
I think it's an important question, because the cost of nets, the capital cost of nets, is about the same cost of establishing a hectare of stand fruit. So with nets, you're basically doubling your capital cost of nets. What we want to gain is that we want to up our cartons per hectare. We either do it by improving the fruit size or the class 1 pack out percentage. But our ultimate goal is, in the stone fruit business at least, I'm sure it's in the apple business more or less the same, is that profitability is mostly coming from cartons per hectare, because cartons per hectare is paying all the bills. It's paying Eskom, the labor cost, the tractor, and even the dog's food. So cartons per hectare is paramount, but it must be quality fruit. So the fruit size must be there. So what we experience, I've got a system which I've put up after planted. So my trees were about 4 or 5 years old before I started to go over to netting. We do experience a lot more vigor, but from a plum perspective, really, it's quite important that you do get nice vigor in a plum orchard to get fruit size. So it's not a negative for me. There's a lot more vigor, but it's not only vegetative vigor, it's also, the fruit is bigger. It's almost as there's a lot more energy in the trees, and we do see it in the fruit size, because basically all the fruit that's been set after the pollination period gets to a proper fruit size.
If you are your fruit bigger because it's fewer then?
No, it's not because they're fewer. This past season was maybe a bit of an anomaly, because we all experienced a huge crop in terms of the plum industry. So it was just an excellent year in terms of fruit set. But there's such a lot of energy under the netting structure that even if you add another 30% of fruit, they get to a proper fruit size. I'm a little bit more worried about the bricks and the TSS of the fruit, so it's important not to put a net up which is giving us too much shade. So I'm less interested in protecting the fruit and the trees against sunburn and this and that. It's mostly about preventing wind damage. But what we find is a better fruit size. Better fruit size is giving you cartons per hectare. Mm-hmm. And under the netting systems, we start seeing class 1 pack-out percentage of 90% quite easily. So most varieties go to 88 to 94% class 1 pack-out, because there's just nothing that's damaging the fruit. Maybe the biggest, let's say class 3 percentage, if you're under a netting system, is fresh injuries or picking injuries. So the other cosmetic problems are basically falling away. So that's a big advantage. And as we mentioned in the beginning, is if you've got cartons per hectare with good fruit size and the proper bricks, you're there.
So what kind of gain have you seen in the number of cartons say percentage, 10% increase in cartons per hectare or 20% or whereabouts would you say?
In Stellenbosch, that can be quite windy, is that after a wind spell, certain varieties can go from the normal 80 or 82% pack out, can go to a 72 or even a 68% class 1 pack out. By calming down the wind, the pack out percentage can be 90% plus. But I would say the biggest gain is possibly in the fruit size and the cartons per hectare. So whether the plum industry normally sits at 4 to maybe 5,000 cartons per hectare, is you can easily go to 7,000 cartons per hectare, 8,000 cartons, 9,000 cartons per hectare, and this past season we've seen 10,000 cartons per hectare plus. So it's about taking your resources, optimize it under this netting system. And I must just add that on my site, we've got the nets, structure over the orchards, but also we covered the sides of the netting system with a 40% net. So it's important not to allow wind underneath. We're blocking the wind with a 45-degree angle on the outside, and the wind is basically jumping over the orchard.
Excellent results. Excellent results. Tell me if I can put you guys maybe on the spot more. What would you say the common mistakes, well, not only you've made, but that people make with nets? The thick nets. What would be the common mistakes that's made?
I think Willie can comment on plum, but on peaches nectarines it's less important in terms of pollination, because peaches and nectarines are self-pollinating. So bees and pollination is less of a problem, but if we talk plums and we talk about this netting structure, I would strongly advise somebody that's planning nets over plum orchards that the structure must be an open-closed system. It's just easier for the bees and it's easier for pollination. And what I also experienced, Vian, is 2 seasons ago we experienced a wet spring. So normally if it's raining a little bit and it's cool in springtime, in September, when the pollination takes place, sometimes you only get, let's say, half a day or 2 days or whatever, a very short period when the weather is good. Then you actually want the bees to go in and pollinate as much as possible of the early flowers, because the early flowers are giving you the best fruit size. By having a flat roof structure that cannot open, it's almost like the bees are more lazy. They slow out of the blocks. And if you've got a time constraint because the next cold front or cold spell is coming in, I would prefer that the pollination must be optimized. So I would say optimize the open-close system on plums, not so necessarily on peaches, nectarines. And then the other factor is that we said that there's a lot more energy due to various reasons under the net system. So you must be an attention to detail producer, because you do have a lot more vegetative growth. So the summer pruning techniques must be optimized. And even after the harvesting period, you need to take away some of the extra water shoots. So if you're not an attention to detail type of person, you're going to be in trouble, because over vigorous system, we know all sorts of problems is coming from that. And I wouldn't suggest if you're not up to that. But if you can control the pollination period, especially with plums, and control the extra vigor, by putting the vigor into the fruit, you're going to be well surprised.
Good. So good management, controlling the shading factor, getting the pollination right.
Exactly.
Willie, in your instance, what did you say some of the main mistakes that people make with nets?
The biggest mistake we've made so far is we haven't planted enough orchards on the net. So that's by far the biggest mistake we've made. I think we've been debating the the finicky details around it, sometimes a little bit too much, and that's almost like procrastination, you know, we don't move forward. So yeah, but in terms of the mistakes we've made, I've seen relative few mistakes, and even if it was a mistake, it wasn't something that couldn't be fixed. So things are fairly versatile, you know. If you don't have an open and closed roof, it's easy to fix it. It's not impossible. So if you're going to be debating the question about what's exactly the right thing to do here, to the finest detail, it might take a little bit longer. But I can highlight perhaps one of the things that we've started off that was a little bit of a mistake is our perimeter posts. On the bone fruit is where we didn't use the proper caliper pole sizes, and by having a lot of trellis wires, especially on dwarfing systems, we tend to pull those poles inwards. And at this stage, it's not an issue, but I think in about 15 years' time, the viability of those poles might be questionable. So that's perhaps one of the mistakes we've made. And then there was one of the other mistakes that we've made is I know for us personally is one orchard where we've had a system that wasn't able to open and close in a snow situation, so that didn't end too well. But yeah, that's perhaps one of the biggest mistakes we've made. The last one that I've seen so far is where you do have an open and closed system, but you have the cross cables running below the nets. So whenever the nets do open and close, they constantly lie on the cable. So that will definitely reduce the lifetime of the cable. So, but in terms of management, I haven't really seen that much issues. There's one or two orchards that might be a little bit too vigorous, but then last week we also visited some orchards in the Kobokkeveld region. That was Crips Red on a 109 rootstock. Planted a little bit further apart, they had space to develop, and the trees were perfectly calm, in excellent condition and good shape. So, yeah, I would say.
Reminds me of one grower, the Landkloof, who told me when I questioned him a couple of years ago, was one of the guys, you know, at the forefront of putting up nets, and I questioned him about putting nets up over a vigorous orchard with vigorous rootstock. And he looked at me and he said, you know, I can still do something with a green Fuji, but I can do nothing with half a Fuji. So I guess that's a good point. So in your case, it's structured definitely, and it leads also very nicely to when I'm going to post. I've just got one last question for both of you. It's maybe a little bit out of your field, but maybe some observations. Pest control, disease control. Have you experienced any issues, seen any issues with pest and disease control under nets? I don't know which of you want to go first. Maybe you can go first to start off. Here's something to it.
So in terms of pest and disease, I'm really not a specialist. But what we've seen so far is if you've taken the capital to invest, especially in the new orchards, where you have the high density planting, where you've paid a lot for your trees, you've paid a lot for your structure, you've paid a lot for your net system, it really becomes an expensive capital onset. So by doing this, you really don't want to slip up on everything. It becomes attention to details. It's whether you have a weevil problem or not, there shouldn't be any weevil in there because you want to optimize the area that you've planted. So there's really attention to detail. We haven't really seen outbreaks of anything so far in terms of diseases, but you don't want to end up in something where you do have some issues. So it's really attention to details. You manage it as if there is a high pressure situation. And the only thing that we've seen so far, and you were with us in the Landkloof so far, is a little bit of woolly apple aphid. That might be more happier under the net than in other situations. So, but in terms of fungi or other insects, we haven't really experienced issues, but we do pay a lot of attention to those orchards that we have under net, just because it's Yeah, it's a lot of money to be lost. Yeah.
Yeah, I think also it seems to link up with what people have found in other parts of the world. With the Apple efforts, yes, and then also, you know, in terms of one would expect maybe something like fusion being a problem, but it's generally not. And what I understand from people who've thought about this a bit is that, you know, and it alludes to what Pietro said about calming the wind, and you can actually spray at times when you otherwise couldn't spray. You've got maybe better drying conditions on your net. Maybe also your product might last a bit longer due to less UV, which can be positive and a negative from the MRL point of view. Pietri, your observations, pest and disease control?
I think it's exactly that. In Stellenbosch, normally in November and December, there can be a lot of wind. Normally at 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock in the morning, the wind is starting to blow and blowing the rest of the day. Under the nets, you've got just another environment. So I think the spraying conditions are more optimal with a higher humidity and slower drying. And I think we're just reaching the target area, and especially the tops of the trees, we're getting it right. So my experience on plums is at least that we almost tend to have less pest and diseases. And Matthew Addison and their team or whatever, they can maybe comment, but it's almost like the insects with a flying pattern. I'm talking about flying pattern to mate. I'm talking about the fruit, it's not the fruit flies, the false cotton moth and cotton moth type of insects. It's almost like the net structure is disrupting that mating flight. So after 3 seasons, the amount of false cotton moth under the nets is basically negligible. So there's almost no false cotton moth left. While in the open orchards, because I've got still open orchards under the normal conventional open system, I do have a bit of activity with false cotton moth. Fruit flies has been affected less, so we do get fruit flies under the nets and also in the open system, but we bait and we do this the normal techniques. But I find it, on average, much easier to control pests and diseases because of the very optimal spraying conditions.
Great. There was one more question I was going to have for your gentleman, but I think I'll just actually answer him, so we can go on to quiz, and that was relating to water and water use under nets. Watercrow is currently funding a project looking at water use under fixed net and drape nets. And I think some of the work's taking place up in the Koopokkerveld Valley. You guys, some of the work's also in the HVV. But generally what I understand from Prof. Mitchell and Dr. Serenatsi and colleagues is that your water saving under net is more or less equivalent in our region, equivalent to the shading factor. So if you have, let's say, 12% shading, you expect about a 12% saving in water. You could expect, if the tree doesn't run off with you. Similarly, 15% shading equivalent to 50% saving in water. Is that, I see you nodding your head, so that's what you're also getting. Okay, good. Quiz, now it's over to you. So you've been patient sitting here and waiting your turn, but now I've got quite a few questions for you on structures. And Vinny and Pietri can take a bit of a rest before we'll get back to them again at the end. And I see there's a lot of questions coming in. It's good. We'll handle those a little bit later. Quiz, so you conducted a study, you were the project lead on a study setting out developing a best practice guideline for netting structures. And you did that, the funders were us, Hillgrow, and CRI and Kaap Agri. Can you tell us a little bit more about the study, how, what the objectives were, how you went about?
Yes. Yes, we are listening to the benefits of netting structures, and also, like Pietri mentioned, it is quite a big investment financially. So on the positive side, it's good to have a netting structure, but it's quite a headache if you wake up one morning and the whole structure has collapsed. It's a financial loss. It's also a loss to your orchard, maybe, or consequential losses to crops or whatever. And then the nature of the person is, who can I blame for this? And there are quite a few role players in setting up a netting structure. There's obviously the owner or the producer. There's the provider or the supplier of the material, like the poles, the cables, the netting itself. Then there's the person doing the installation. And one of these role players, Kaap Agri, came along about 2 years ago and said he feels exposed from a business risk point of view, if there is a problem, they can come to him and say, but it's your poles that broke, and therefore my structure collapsed, and now he's sitting with the blame. And because of that risk management, and because of the large investment, these parties have decided then to have some sort of a guideline how to invest this money so that we reduce the risks for everybody involved in that structure.
So how did you go about conducting the study?
Well, one of the first things is Gabriel asked us to do a scoping exercise on what it's all about and what can be achieved. And we have visited 4 regions, fruit-growing regions. I must say that includes citrus and grapes as well, not only bone and stone fruit. And we came back with an idea of what the need is. And to summarize it very quickly, firstly, there's an urgency. People say, you should have been here 2 years ago. Secondly, there's a concern. What should I do? I want nets, but I don't want to waste so many millions of rand and then I have a problem. The other thing is the frustration. He asks a quotation, he gets a quotation, but there's no clarification or detail on what all of this is. He cannot compare his quote to another quote because he doesn't know what is specified. And lastly, just confusion in general. Why are they doing it this way and why are they doing it that way? And what is a better way to do? And that was at that stage what we have found. And that is then when we've started developing this best practice. And what we've actually done is we've taken an average of what is available because there are good netting structures out there. There's no use redesigning the wheel. Then we have applied engineering principles. Firstly, looked at what international standards there are or national standards for netting structures. If we start off with structures, there are many, but a netting structure is a little bit different from a fixed structure like you see in a building or a bridge. A netting structure is what we call a dynamic structure. It moves because it's not set in the foundation like a big building. And the weather and the wind has impact, is more flexible. So all that movements over time plays a role that we need to take into account as well. So we've taken all that inputs and we've developed this standard for what we call a dynamic netting structure. Okay, and basically that is what we have. And what we've also found is not only the technical side of things that's important, it's also the acquisition process. How do you install a netting structure? And that goes with contracting, specification, quality control, and all that kind of stuff. And that all is included in the netting structure because we feel it's important. If you want to have a good result, you have to go through this process to eventually achieve that.
Okay, so that was actually that part 2. Was back on the farm, in terms of, because ultimately the problem is if the system fails. What were the main deficiencies, structural deficiencies that your team found? What were the main reasons for structures failing?
Yeah, I wish I had one simple answer for you, but there is no one single cause that one can highlight. So it's not cable snapping or poles breaking, or yes, we find a lot of nets tearing, but actually the netting material itself is not part of the structure. It's only covering the structure so that you can open and close the nets as well if that is a requirement. And eventually, there are 3 causes that you can get together, which would eventually culminate into some kind of a failure. The first one is, what do you design the net for? What are the conditions that you design for? Is it a 40-kilometer wind or a 200-kilometer cyclone? Is it hail or not hail? Is it snow or not snow? Then also your soil conditions, your ground conditions. And what we're talking here is disturbed soil. So normally you would build a building on fixed soil, but agricultural orchard is normally being plowed or deplowed, so you have disturbed soil, and that all contributes to this dynamic structure of a net. Okay, and that makes it a little bit difficult. So what we would say, if there's a failure, then what you have is that your net structure was not able to withstand the environmental conditions that adverse weather has impacted on it. So that's why step 1 is decide what you need this netting structure to do in terms of keeping the weather out.
Okay.
And how do you define that weather? What type of wind speeds are we talking about, etc., etc. And that all of that come down. That's the main reason. The secondary reason is installation. Even the best netting components you can put together in the next design, if the guys on the floor that's doing the installation is not doing their job properly, then I think I would rather say most of the failures is as a cause of that. Cables pulling out of their things and the connectors was installed properly, that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of smaller things that need to be attended to. Literally, coined the phrase, you need to do some precision farming under the net, but I think you need to do some precision installation as well when you put up a netting structure, definitely so.
Maintenance, does that also play a role?
Maintenance is quite important, and many people would not believe what maintenance in a structure entails. But because of these movements that you have due to wind and temperature and water differences, the structure starts to move. The dynamic nature is that you have quite a few poles and cables keeping up the whole structure. If one of those would snap due to overtension, and you get overtension by these movements that come together at, say, one cable, the forces that cable would carry is then transferred to his neighbors and to their neighbors. And then you get this kind of domino effect, and like a zip opening, and then the whole structure collapses. So one solution is basically to have your risk contained in little blocks, so you can only have a block failure. But even that, to prevent that, you need to know that there's an interrelationship between all your elements of your structure, and that in maintenance over time, you need to test that. And we have also gone so far as developing a cable tensioning device. So after installation, we would test the tensions in the cables, and in a year or two, retest, and then advise on how to tension the structure so that you get back to new again, if I can put it. And then you will prolong the lifespan of your netting structure, so that it deals with risks.
So basically, design issues, installation issues, maintenance issues. I must say, I recently sprung a leak on my roof, and I had somebody come out and went on top of the roof, and he basically literally jumped up and down about the poor maintenance. He says, your roof's 40 years old, and you haven't been doing this, you haven't been doing that, and no wonder you sprung the leak, and it's going to escalate, and your whole thing's going to. So I guess, if one consider that, realizing the building roof's got to be maintained, a net structure needs to be maintained too.
Yes, definitely so, yeah.
Something I also found very interesting was, I don't know whether you want to elaborate it, but your colleague, Wouter Visser, did also a bit of the work, or quite a bit of the work. He explained to me one day in terms of the forces that works onto a net structure. He said, imagine the wing of a Boeing.
Yeah.
And, the kind of lift that it's got when the wind moves over it. And then he explained, 60 kilometer, 70 kilometer wind blowing over a 1 hectare net structure. And he went further and explained, the shape of the land. You've got a convex shape or what's concave shape.
Yeah.
The one tries to push the poles in the ground, the other one tries to pull them out. Yeah. I found that very interesting because that's, I guess, engineer's way of looking at things.
Exactly so, yeah. And those are all the eventualities that you need to cater for. So very important is that you don't get a netting design for every application. So step one is go to that specific orchard, look at the conditions, what are the risks the producer or the owner wants to take or wants to cover, and then design according to that. And then that specific design is built for that specific case.
Okay. So although you can have guidelines, you can't have this. You can have a minimum standard, I guess, for every single case. It's a new specification, new design.
Yeah,
and that's an important point.
Yeah. No, we had a long debate in the start. If you remember, what is a standard, or what is a guideline, or what is a specification? Yeah. A guideline or standard is a more overall solution. These are the steps that you have to go through, but a specification is specifically for an orchard. And so the design process is basically to take the guideline and take all the conditions and the requirements and the aims of what you want to achieve, and then develop a specification for implementation. That also allows then the quality control, because you cannot quality control if you don't have anything. And there are two levels of quality control that we refer to in a standard. The one is the quality of the design, and the other one is the quality of the installation. And we also recommend that if the owner wants to divert his responsibility or accountability to the installation or the design, that those people that he contracts to do the work sign off, acceptance or certify their work that they've installed. And that's all included in our process that we recommend for installation.
Because so if somebody in the audience now is a farmer who's never, had anything on the nets, and he's actually listening today because he's considering netting.
Yes.
He's a bit worried about the cost and a bit worried about, concerned about the nets failing and so on. What's the first step? Well, how should he go about? Who should he approach? Who should he speak to? Where does he access these guidelines?
Okay. I think that process is set out very nicely in this guideline. There's a diagram, step 1, 2, 3 as you go along. It's not a big document, less than 30 pages. So I would say step 1 is get hold of this standard and read through that and would guide you to go through. Unfortunately, this standard is not published yet. It is issued under the auspices of the South African Institute of Agricultural Engineers. And I've received a promise this morning within the next 2 weeks it will be published on their website. And then I will also send a copy to you so that you can put it on the Orca website. So if people don't get anything with or a circular stating that that's best practice guideline is available, they can contact you and you can contact me and we'll assist them in you going through that.
I know you also, it was a very important step in the process, kind of quality control. And you took the guidelines to the fieldlands.
Yes.
And you got the input from a lot of technical people. So I understand there's still a few add-ons that still need to be incorporated in the guidelines.
Yes. Since we have the draft guideline out about a few months ago, end of last year, we were lucky that we are involved at 10 netting structures now, which we have taken through this process. And I must say it works. And that's what we've proven now. The clients are happy, they know what's going on now, they know where they should look and what the critical points are in the installation. So that is a one benefit. But also what we pick up now is that there are lots of other things that we can add to this guideline. So this is a living document, and we will add to this as we go along, and more detail will come through. So yes, and that's the purpose of a standard, is they call it the best known solution to mankind. If we get better solutions, we just update the standard, and so eventually we will contribute to better netting structures for. Okay.
Now I understand also why the export standards go up every year. So. Thanks for that, Chris. It was very good. I don't know, Willie, Pietri, do you also want to make any contributions on the structure side? Say anything about that? You're welcome.
I think they are very, very good. I've seen this document. It's a very good start. As Chris mentioned, this document is going to grow. There are very good contractors out there, but because of the lack of this information, there was almost in the past course, I would say, an over-design of systems and sometimes an under-design which caused problems with excess wind or snow. But this is maybe an engineering concept, but really what I do find in the field, and especially if you talk to people about nets, there's definitely not consistency in terms of on plums for late season varieties. You use this color of net and this class or whatever. There's still an inconsistency of recommendations on the horticultural side. And as we mentioned, there's still a bit of research to be done. At least there was a very nice master's degree thesis being done on netting structures and the influence on plums. But there's still a lot of work to do, but it's a great start.
Really?
Yeah, I think from the Apple side, the biggest challenge will come from incorporating the structure with the trailer system, and some unique challenges that we have that they don't have in other parts of the world, where we don't pick on the bin on the ground and we have picking alleys and stuff like that. So you're tensioning some of the wires to the middle of the post. So I think that's where some of our biggest challenges will be. So you design something for one reason, but then you interrupt the wires in the middle and picking roads and stuff like that. So which will make us unique in the way we harvest. So you can always copy and paste something that's been working in severe climates overseas, and then you modify it a little bit. So I think that's where one of our challenges will be, is just the incorporation of those two things with heavy crop loads and weaker tree structures. So that rely more on the complete system to keep them up. So.
Yes, Björn, maybe we can just announce that there's another project under the auspices for Grow that looks at the structure of trailer structures for dwarf woodstock levels. And once that is completed, then we can then we can combine it too. Yeah. And I think then that's how we grow, step by step.
Fantastic. Good. Yeah, and Wouter and you yourself, you're running that project. Yeah.
Yes.
Good. Vali, Pietri, the last couple of questions for each of you. I see we're getting on time. Vali, your recommendations ultimately, if you've got to summarize them for apple producers, what would you recommend? When you already said, in case, the biggest mistake you've made was not going fast enough. But I mean, it might differ between regions. What's your general recommendation in nets?
I think one of the reasons why we struggle to put up nets or are reluctant to put up nets is the amount of labor it will take to open and close. And not on the smaller farming units, but especially on a bigger farming unit. If you envision a farm of 200 or 300 hectares being covered under net, it's going to be a huge challenge if you need to start opening and closing that amount of stuff. I mean, there's going to be certain periods of time where you won't be able to do anything because you'll have a lot of equipment that needs to be incorporated into the cost of it to open and close this. So the guys are being put off by that idea of the amount of labor and the time it will take to open and close it. But I think it comes down to starting off and gearing yourself as you go along and having the philosophy of doing it on the right thing on the right time. And as we grow in volume, we will get the right things in place and we will learn more. So, like I said, there's been less mistakes where we've put our net and we don't have the net. If you've seen the last, not this season, but the previous season in the Witzenberg wasn't nice, and I mean, we can go on and on and on. So it's a loss that you take each year. But to summarize going forward, I think when you do plant an orchard, you need to get the maximum profit out of that. And it's one of the things where you can make a massive improvement on your pack out. And it's very seldom that you find something that will make such a big contribution to your pack out. I mean, a lot of times we do a lot of research and then we do a lot of experiments and stuff, and we find a 5 or a 6 or a 7% improvement, and it's significant, and it's wow. We try to save 5 or 10% water, but it allows you to farm more, but it doesn't make that much of an impact. But this is something that really can make a massive impact on your pack out. So we've done a little bit of a calculation also for that orchard of the future, and it was an eye-opening, revealing that you can spend a lot of money and still not be better off than you was with the traditional planting. So if you really want to make an improvement on your pack outs, it's really something that you need to consider, especially on bicolors and especially on club varieties. I think if you look at some of the commodity varieties like red apples and goldens, it might be less important. You'll have other philosophy and other planting system for that. But if you look at the club varieties and the bicolors, it's really something that we need to consider and move along with. And that will also allow us to incorporate the narrow canopies and be more efficient with other technology. I was looking at the stone fruit presentation, the last one from last night, and it all came back to the same thing, then being more productive, having less drift on your sprays, narrow canopies, harvesting less, being more effective in the pack out. So it all comes down to the systems approach of coming back to that 1 hectare, and I don't think there's an alternative to it. Like I said, you can have these very narrow canopies, and you can still have hail, and in one instance you lose the entire crop. We've seen it with the narrow canopies, and you're actually better off with a little bit bigger tree that you have the inside buffer towards a little bit of sleet or something. But as soon as you get these very open canopies and you have slight disruption, almost all your fruit gets marked instantly. And the same with the sunburn. You can have 2 or 3 hard days, or just one extremely hard day, and you've compromised everything that you've done in the entire season. So it's one of those things that you just can't get around. So I really see this as the future in having an insurance policy for that orchard and being as productive as you can on that one piece of land for that. So
Thanks, Willie, for that summary. It sounds to me indispensable part of risk management, and also in terms of the system approach, it's working towards efficiency gains, working towards quality gains, working towards productivity gains, and nets is integral in your mind, all of those in Apple. And if you want to read any of those, the people listening, if you want to read more about the Orchard Future project and the findings that Willie has also alluded to, you can just go onto Hortgrow Science's website and look for the fresh quarterlies. It's downloadable for free, and all the information is in there about the findings of the Orchard Future project, the first phase.
So just a last comment here, before I shoot myself in the foot, but obviously you've seen the pictures from Stephanie Mitchley yesterday as well, and you've seen the different areas, and the comments I made is very specific to what we've experienced. Obviously you will be able to grow galas in the Grambo area with a very red loam, which has less risk of sunburn. So again, it's looking at what your biggest risks are and finding something that will reduce that. So if you're in an area that never had hail before, or you have less than 5% sunburn, obviously there are alternatives to it. But in our situation where we've been farming and our experiences, we've seen a massive gain and improvement.
Actually, that's a good clarification also, I think, yeah. Thanks. Day3, your summary in terms of your recommendations to growers of plums regarding nets.
I think plums or stone fruit wise, I can almost agree with Pravin Gordhan, the previous finance minister, let's say three ministers down the line. He once said about 5-6 years ago, we must do more with less. And I think that's what nets can unlock for us. I grew up in the Karl-Bokkerveld area, and when I grew up, there was a lot of land. There was a lot of extra water, and there was a lot of water that was running to the sea. There was a lot of everything, but there was maybe a lack of capital and maybe also human capital. In the meantime, I think a lot of farmers or farms got bigger. If you take the Klein Karoo area, there's almost a shortage of water. I mean, almost all the fruit areas has reached the optimal usage of water, and there's a lot of farmers with a certain percentage of high potential land. And I think with nets we can unlock the limited amount of water we've got and the limited amount of high potential land that we've got. And by doing more cartons per hectare or more cartons on a farm with a limited amount of water and a limited land, because we don't have more and more land and we reach our limit in terms of water. So to come back to stone fruit, personally, I think the color of the nets is less important than what we initially thought. 20% crystal net, blue or grey, it can do its thing. It's maybe a little bit different if you sit in a very high or light area with a high amount of sun exposure and you want to prevent sunburn, then you can up the class of the nets, let's say from class 20 to class 30, but there must be a good reason for that. I think Koos and his team, they've got a very good document that's documenting the strength of the poles and the cables and the quality of that. So for the first time, we're going to get that qualities. Plumb-wise, as I mentioned, I think it's most important, get to a system that can open and close. There are a lot of systems, the flat systems that cannot open and close. But as Billy mentioned, there's a very simple way of adapting that and putting in brackets on every second cable and open and close it. So plumb-wise, my feeling is let's open and close it. Peaches and nectarines, not necessary. So sunfruit-wise, if you can overcome the pollination problems and just manage the extra vigor, I think you're fine. And the sunfruit industry has got the advantage, sorry to say, really over the plum industry, in the sense that a lot of the sunfruit orchards have been picked in December or January. So just after the harvest, we can open up the system and we get full exposure with full sun. So we don't get, I don't get the feeling that we're going to run into the, let's say, not so fertile type of orchards, overgrown and shadowy or whatever. So there is definitely a little bit more effort that must go in. And I want to ask Koos to include in the structures, especially if it's a closed structure. What I've seen on my system is the guinea fowls and small bucks or whatever, they're running into the system. And then tonight when they go, they want to fly to the trees or whatever, they trap inside. So including the system every 100 meters or so, just a 1 meter by 1 meter gap that the guys can go up and down. So that's my statement of the arm years in terms of our wildlife.
Thank you. And Peter, I like what you said about optimizing the use of resources. Now resources are limited, so it makes sense to optimize. Are we still on board? Have we lost anybody? Can we get indication the power just came back on, the ESCOM power? Everything's all good? Okay, good. Thanks, Dia. So we continue with questions. We got quite a few questions, and we'll try to address all of them. So you can maybe just scroll up for me to the beginning of the questions.
Oh, yeah.
This is not me. Oh. Okay, all right. So there was a question about the water saving. I've addressed it. Temperature differences, I'll just quickly, some of those I'll just handle. Temperature differences, air temperature, very slight, but the difference comes in terms of fruit temperature, which can be quite, exposed fruit in an open orchard can be up to 15 degrees warmer than your shaded, than the air temperature. And if you shade, you get away with that. You don't have that big, temperature increase or heat load on your fruit. So your fruit is at a lower temperature, they don't burn. That's the real thing you want to do. You want to decrease your fruit temperature. You also don't want to build up of heat in your canopy. The reasons for better growth and fruit size. There's various reasons. Therefore, the better growth is a combination of maybe a milder climate in terms of availability of water. On very hot days, especially with the winds blowing, the tree can't keep up with the demand of the environment in terms of the water moving out of the leaf, so the tree then shuts down, closes up the stomata, and try to prevent water loss. But obviously that means that the carbon dioxide can't get into the leaf, and you don't have your photosynthesis continuing. Now on the net, with a milder climate, water potentially more available, and all that can happen. And that's why I think one of the reasons why we typically see bigger fruits on the fixed nets. But fixed nets, that's not necessarily the same on the drape nets. And yes, Petrus alluded to it, that you have to be on the lookout in terms of your TSS. If your shading factor is too high, that can have a significant effect. But on the other hand, Petri, which you also alluded to, if you've got a, crystal kind of net over a plum or peach or something like that, or a white net, it shouldn't be so big a difference. That's also your expectation.
It was quite interesting on plums. If you use a class 20 net, so it's reducing UV by 20%, 6% shade, there's almost no significant difference in terms of the sugar content. You start changing your bricks if you're upping your cartons per hectare. So there's just a correlation, but it's not because of the nets. It's actually more because of the bigger crop per hectare.
Yeah, because the carbohydrates on the net should actually be in, if you don't have too much shade, there should be ample carbohydrates. So yeah, I hear what you say. If you've got too many fruit competing for the carbohydrate, then you start to see the effect.
But maybe you can explain the process of photo inhibition on a hot day, because I think that's what we do experience in plums. Maybe you can explain the process, because I think it's quite interesting science.
Yeah, Petri and I spoke a little bit of physiology when you arrived here early, and over a cup of coffee. And the photo inhibition issue is, in our conditions, there's more than enough light for at least the exposed fruit leaves on the tree. And under our conditions, those leaves go into kind of a depression of photosynthesis over midday, induced by the heat, but also induced by the closure of stomata. Now the net, with a milder climate, there might be less of a need for stomata to close. There's also less of a heat load on the leaves, so you might still get a depression of photosynthesis, but it might take a little bit longer to get there. And on days it's maybe not extremely hot, but hot enough you normally would get that depression. You might not get it under the net, so that's all okay.
You've got a more productive orchard.
Yeah. Exactly. If you don't have too much shade. If you've got too much shade, you don't control your growth, like also alluded to Petri. If your shade becomes an issue, then you may have problems. But if you manage it, then not. Really, I saw you also want to comment.
Yeah, we see there exactly the same in the apples, that little test plot on Bartlett, where we covered those dwarfing rootstocks in the beginning. We see with the like-for-like crop, we always see about 10 to 15 grams increase in fruit size for those apples as well. So
okay, and TSS, if you see any big,
no, we don't have issues with that.
Okay, good, so not a problem. All right. Where's the next one? Okay. Financing remains. Could financing be an option on net systems? What would you as producers say is the ideal repayment term to make sure that your cash flow is not under pressure? I think it's a kind of question for you, Petri.
I'm actually a horticulturist, so I think you must talk to your bank manager. But I think in terms of the structure, so I'm talking about what Koos is talking about, the poles, the cables, the structure that anchors, is that we know that the structure can keep for quite a long time, longer than 10 years. Most of the net manufacturers, they guarantee their nets for about 10 years, 10 to 12 years. So I think over a lifespan of about 20 years, you're possibly going to replace the nets once, but it's going to be quite interesting, really, if we look at the poles and the structures that we've got from older systems. I'm talking about netting systems, the trellising systems in orchards. We can see that the poles can keep for quite long, more than 20 years. So the structure can keep quite long. So in terms of depreciation and financing, I think we can basically back that the system can work for us for at least 10 years. The structure can actually work longer. But the financing of that, or whatever, I think that's every business is going to have different angles on that. Really?
Yeah. In the apples, I'm not sure. Our existing or pre-existing trellis systems, they were used as guiding systems while the tree was growing up, and then by year 7 or 8, the trees are used to keep the poles upright, and vice versa. So we can't really comment on what the trees were pretty much self-standing. I think we will see some challenges on the newer rootstocks. Yeah, like I mentioned in the beginning, it will be interesting to see what those poles would be looking like in 20 years' time after tensioning. But yeah, in terms of repayment, I will also refer you to someone with a calculator.
Yeah, this is probably not this panel normally deals with in terms of, so Petri said it, more the horticultural side, physiology, the engineering side. So the questions about deposit percentage and so forth, I think that's a question that need to be discussed with the bank manager. On the point of actually discussing stuff, everything is said and done, and there's been a lot of talk about the nets and so on, and Willie also alluded to it that each particular instance will be different potentially, and the area and so on, depending on the decision, and all the presenters actually alluded to it. So I would also always recommend that, apart from maybe chatting to the bank manager and the insurer and all those guys I will obviously need to chat with, and all the people mentioned in the guidelines, supplier and installer and so on, that before embarking on netting, that will also speak to your technical advisor. There's quite a few technical advisors in the industry with a lot of experience of nets. And there's also some neighbors who won't mind if you look over the fence and chat to them about the experiences. So I think that's also still always a very good idea to talk to people who are knowledgeable and discuss the reasons and ideas about netting before one embark on something like that. Okay, we must measure photosynthetic active radiation, UV, and infrared radiation to determine how different types of net, woven, knitted, and colors can better suit the needs of the industry. That's remarked by Hans. Yes, so I'm keeping my eye on some work being done in Washington State, where the researcher there, Lee Kalsitz, somebody we also in the future want to invite out to South Africa for Symposium and so on. He's been doing work on different nets. You're looking at blue net, red net, all the different colors of net. When considering color of net, of course, there's a lot of talk about photoselective netting, the different wavelengths of that's being taken away or so forth. I think in our environment, there's already one consideration that one's not going to forget about, and that's the visual impact of netting. So I think we're always going to have a problem with yellows and reds and those kind of things. And that's where we need to try to blend into the environment. We're in a picturesque part of the world, and we don't want to spoil the visual appeal of our environment. So that's an important consideration for me. And then I think if one go with monochromatic nets, so your purples and your whites and your greys and your blacks, you tend to be safe. I mean, you're just changing the percentage of light, the percentage of shading, and one is safe. I think I wouldn't embark on big plantings on photoselectives if one's not sure about the research results. The results of Lee so far that I've seen, most of the differences that he observed between nets relate to the actual amount of light that's being reflected and so on. The shading factor and not necessarily the photoselective results. But on the other hand, I saw pictures when you alluded to the webinar for the International Peach Symposium that's currently on in the evenings, and I saw a picture with where one could see an effect on vigor with a photoselective net. So jury's maybe still out a little bit. Some work to be done. If Don's listening, Don Brink's listening, he could maybe also type an answer in the text box. When he was working with Ortro, and to a day he did some work also with photoselective netting, and as far as I can understand or remember, his results were also mostly related to the shading factor, not really anything else. I don't know if you guys have got experience of different colors, nets, and Petri, Willie, the blues and the reds and the yellows and those things.
No, but I think it remains a good practice to, wherever you put up something, that also came from Don, and you've got those trials for yourself as well. And we've got a couple of them going as well. So when in doubt, just put up something else, just so we can learn. I mean, it's the fastest way that we as an industry will learn. And if you will have it, if everyone starts doing it, you will pretty much have a few or a lot of contrast in different areas where you can start learning. I don't think there's going to be a one-size-fits-all for every situation. So.
And Robert himself, the work I remember also has got a lot of different colors of nets, or added a lot of different colors of nets. We're also played around with various combinations, so that's also somebody one can speak to. Does frost risk increase under nets? When frost is probably not an issue at Stellenbosch, Pietri, Willie, if you guys observed anything about frost risk?
I think if you have, especially if the sides are closed, you have a little bit of a buffer, but that's going to be for minor frost. But from my understanding, I've done a little bit of asking around. If you do get to the severe frost in the Free State, the nets are not really going to have so much of a buffer. So you will still have to do frost mitigation.
Right.
So if you have a frost area, need something to mitigate the frost more effective than the net.
Okay, so minor frost may be a little bit of an effect, but major frost, no. What's the feeling about drape net? Now we're talking about fixed net today, but I think we can maybe just, it might be insightful. Willie, your thoughts on drape net, or situations where your group would consider drape rather than fixed nets?
Yeah, we do expand on a lot of drape net projects. We've got mostly the black for the yellow and the green varieties, and that's mostly for sunburn as well, but we do have in some areas where we get hail. And then we also see a lot of potential for the white drape netting for bicolors. We've been planning around with it for the last 2 or 3 seasons, and we see a lot of positive results. And it's a lot cheaper than putting up a permanent structure. And it solves a lot of the issues that you can do. So you can really open up the canopy and still get good light penetration and color on the inside with a reduction on sunburn again. And yeah, it's exactly the same as with some of the fixed netting on an open canopies, where you end up getting that fruit that was perfectly colored on the outside of the tree. You get that into a carton. So we do see a lot of potential for that, and we keeping a close eye on that project as it develops for other defects. But so far it's been going very good. So
good. And I would imagine your 40-year-old Granny Smith orchard you might want to put under a drape net and up the back out significantly, but you're not going to put a fixed net over that 40-year-old granny orchard on seating rootstock.
Yeah, you don't want to spend the investment on having the cables and the poles, because it gets very expensive. Even formalizing the drape net structure just to keep it above the tree also becomes very expensive very quickly. So there's a good potential to keep it at an informal system as a very good alternative, where you can't do the permanent netting, or you don't have to.
Pietri, do you think drape netting may have a place in stone fruit production?
I don't have a lot of experience drape nets and stone fruit. What I can say is it's of paramount importance that we don't change the bricks and the aroma of stone fruit by using nets. And on average, we try to use a class 20, or we try to use a net that's not influencing that aspect of the quality of fruit. So maybe you can just comment on the use of drape nets and the amount of shade percentage, because I would be a little bit reluctant to use that, because it seems like there's a tendency of overshadowing or a bigger shade percentage, which can maybe have an influence on something that we don't want, that is bricks.
Yeah, Willie, I told Pietri about the results of the preliminary results of a project where we're looking at what to use on the drape nets, and the shading factor was actually quite significant, much more than the shading factor of the net itself. And I think it's by the effect on the canopy and on the shoots. But you've alluded to opening up the canopy, to allow the light to come in. So it's something that one can probably can probably manage. But yes, whether one wants drape net touching your stone fruit wall, I'm also not sure on the outside. Yeah, so that is a factor. I mean, I think, you know, with the drape net, one might need to pay even more attention to light management, you know, especially in the case of apples, you know, where drape net is preferentially going over more vigorous rootstocks sometimes. Okay, let's see what's next. Will the guidelines be made available? Yes, I think we've handled that one. Soon, hopefully, the body who's responsible, the South African Institute for Agriculture Engineers, hopefully soon on the website, and then subsequently on the Water Science website. Okay. I just want to determine the quality of wooden poles. You can have two poles of the same size, but the density of the wood differs, so their strength is not the same. New options of steel or concrete poles seem more consistent strength-wise. Yes, that is a benefit of steel and concrete, that they can be more consistent. But of course, this sounds like a question to you in terms of wooden poles, you know, maybe different strengths.
No, that's true, and that's one of the disadvantages of using wood poles. There are some risks, and that's where the installation person comes in. Normally what they do, they order a little bit more than they need. And when a pole is suspect, they push it outside, they don't use it. Or they use good quality poles at the corners because that's where they take the most strain. The internal poles basically is only just to keep the necking off, so it's not of that big concern. When we developed the standard, we've only looked at wooden poles, and eventually we haven't made a distinction between whether it's a pine pole or a bluegum pole, because for this purpose it's not that critical. It's more a quality issue. So make sure that when you use the poles, that specific pole don't have any visual cracks or dents or defects that may have a negative impact on the quality of that. Steel and concrete poles, yes, is more consistent from a scientific point of view, but again, it's also much more expensive. But and I think that's one of the next waves of development that we can do is maybe have a combination pole. You know, start off with the steel pole and then carry on with the concrete or wooden pole. And we've already had discussions in that field, and one of these days you might see a solution like that coming to the fore.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, I see a question. Do nets have an impact on chill units? I think there was a similar question Tuesday put to Nigel Cook when we discussed chilling models, and if I remember his answer correctly, Martin can just nod if I do. He said he doesn't think it's got a major impact. I mean, there might be a little bit of, you know, the buds might not heat up to the same extent, but, you know, the temperature of buds is not used in the calculation of chill units. We still work with air temperature, and the net doesn't really affect the air temperature all that much. You know, the air temperature might be a little bit lower during the day, it might be a little bit higher through the night, but generally it's not supposed to really impact the chill units meaningfully. But yeah, I don't know if you've observed any differences in bud rate response, you know, on the nets, also not. Okay. Also, what I know from the published literature is that people generally don't remark on that as an effect of nets.
Especially if the net system is open in winter.
Yeah. Well, then it's got no effect. Yeah, but if it's closed, I think there's a comment. Once you have invested in platforms for pruning, thinning, harvesting, etc., net structures might or get very difficult due to the height of the cable. So on their farm, trees are 5 meters high. So then it becomes a bit of an issue. I would assume that there's some, you know, considerations like that. I mean, Willie, are you guys looking at harvesting with platforms, etc.? Not really.
No, not harvesting with platforms, but we do use platforms for opening and closing the nets and doing works on that. We've gone through various models and testing. I think we're getting to a stage now where we do get 1 or 2 good options. But yeah, most of our trees are below 5 meter height, so it's not an issue for us. The nets are normally at about 5 meter.
Okay, all right. So it also depends on the situation, but you know, if the trees are that tall, then obviously, you know. There's a comment from Hans, just to buy poles from SABS or SAS accredited suppliers. So thanks for that comment, Hans. All right, Peter Johnson. He says, I know they've done research with subtropical fruit, the impact of net color on average good spread. Now, thanks, Peter. I'm familiar with that work. Well, I know the work, I'm not familiar. Okay, I can go and have a look at it again. It's interesting, it does seem that different crops respond differently to photoselective netting. There's a lot of work on vegetables and flower crops where it does seem to play quite a big role. It seems to be less the case in apple for most of the studies I've seen. And I'm not sure about stone fruit, to what extent photoselective nets has an effect. But it's something one can look at again. Okay, Thomas Babel, he says the fraction of light might impact the drape nets. Yes, I think you're right, Thomas. That's another engineer. Also reflection when light hits the nets at the shadow angle. Yes, you're quite correct. Now I listened to a talk organized by Peter Dahl still quite a while ago, a couple of years now, in Ceres, where they got the net expert from Italy, to talk about nets. It was very interesting. He also mentioned the effect of horizontal flat nets versus angled nets, and how they affect the interplay with the sun's angle. Is actually very interesting. So if you've got an angled net, there's the sun hits a net perpendicular in the afternoon or late afternoon or in the morning when it's not so hot, but more the angle during the middle of the day when it's hot. So he suggested that could be an added advantage of having gabled nets versus a flat horizontal net where you probably have more reflection and more absorption in the morning and the afternoon when it's actually not that hot and your light level is not so high, and with the sun actually hitting the net perpendicularly then during the middle of the day when it's hotter. So that was also a very interesting observation. So yes, thanks Thomas for that comment. Hans says they've observed, and I think Hans, this probably relates very much to your experience in the Free State, less bud damage in winter under nets. Okay, and that can allude to the heating of the buds. Are there any other questions? Okay, so those are questions. I've got one more question. I thought I'll leave it right till the end. If there was a bit of time. Willie, there's still a question of, me and you, we've chatted about it a little bit. What about pears? We've spoken a lot about apples, we've spoken about stone fruit, but we actually haven't looked at pears. Now, I guess there's situations where you also put pears on the nets just due to hail risk. What are your observations or what's your thoughts about that?
Well, we haven't done that, but yeah, we've spoken about that, and I've been doing a little bit of testing, and I know various other producers in the Landcliffs also doing some tests on that. So with the bicolors, the results doesn't always seem that promising. I'll leave the answer to you, but yeah, you can explain that part. But and then with the green bears, the packums and stuff like that, the drape netting, and I would assume a permanent net would, or which you can open and close in the winter, would also do well. The results on the drape nets have seemed promising, but I'll leave you the explanation for the color part to you, since you explained it to me. So.
Morris from Westlands in the Landkloof told you that their group has got very good results with nets on the green pear varieties. They reduced wind rub quite a lot, and that's also one of the main cull factors on a packum and a BC and those kind of things, Petri, which would normally would be the first crop that comes to mind if you consider netting. But he actually said, that's where they probably found one of the biggest returns on investment with drape netting, I think, in the instance. With Varroa pears,
and sunburn of packums.
Yeah, sunburn of packums, that's a good thing too, thanks Willie. And then also greener fruit color, which can also be an advantage. Dr. Alka Crouch, she did some work on Varroa. She was studying mealiness, and there's a well-established fact now that the inside fruit in the canopy is less prone to mealiness than the outside canopy fruit, but you all know that we're farming for those red Varroas. And she was just looking at netting and to what extent it can also affect, it can maybe reduce mealiness without actually affecting color. So it was not really successful in that regards, because you could produce mealiness, but then mean, only when you shaded them to become green, to that level. What you did, however, found that there was no negative, the least negative effect was with a net with a lower shading factor. And there was no, you probably didn't get a hell of a benefit in terms of leanness, but you didn't get any negative effects with using the least negative effects with using let's say a white net and a pill net would be even better in terms of color development. Yeah, the problem is that the bears develop their max color midway through the season, then starts to decrease. So if you reduce that mid-season peak, you might actually not have such great color at the end. Okay, I see Karen's got a question. Not sure whether this was discussed when I was off air, but what about retractable nets in case of wind damage that occurs very early in spring on plum? That's a good question, Petri. That's one for you. Your reason why you're enclosing your plums with nets is due to you want to reduce wind damage. Karen's question is basically how early is it that damage should occur? The right amount of wind damage on the plums. If you have nets that can open and close, how early should one actually close it? Can one close it early enough, to prevent?
Yeah, I think the nets in the stone fruit, especially on a plant farm, is working quite well because let's say, for instance, we take a full bloom date of the 20th of September. So let's give or take the full bloom date of the tissues. The first 2 to 3 weeks after the full bloom period is a cuppy on the young plants. So in that first 2 or 3 weeks, so I would say, I would argue until about the 5th or the 6th of October, the little plant fruit is definitely not susceptible to any wind damage because of the protective cuppy. Mm-hmm. After that, that cuppy is dropping, and then that young fruit, that is the super sensitive period because there's almost a bloom or glaze on that fruit. It's the young cuticle that's not been hardened off, so that next 2 to 3 weeks until pip hardening, I would say is the most sensitive time. So Karen, to answer that question is that if you can close the nets within the next 2 to 3 weeks after you remove the beehives, you're going to be fine. Don't try and close the nets while the bees are there because you're gonna find trouble. But after removal of the beehives, close it. But that first part of the growing season, especially until pip hardening, is a very, very sensitive area. A small mark is growing to a big cosmetic mark later on. And then the sensitivity of especially plums in terms of cosmetic marks, it's getting a little bit lower after pip hardening. But it's actually, I would say, October month and maybe November. That's the most crucial. But normally after pruning, winter pruning, and before thinning, there's a 2 to 3 week gap, which on farms you've got that time to close it. Just for people that's interested, I've got a platform or two, very, very simple to close or to help closing the nets, and it's costing about 2,000 rand per hectare to close the nets. It's costing again after the season another 2,000 rand per hectare to open the nets, but I pay that 4,000 rand per season
with the 4,000 extra accountants.
So it's not even making a blip on the radar. It's absolutely, if I'm through the pollination period, I can start seeing the small fruit and I can close my crop. It's the best time of the year.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think but also I don't know whether Chris Stradom is attending today, or any of or Nick, or any of the people from Woolsey, but I know you're also considering or thinking about nets on pears, but it would be the same kind of a consideration that one will have in terms of when on those young pears, when does the damage happen, and that'll affect what's thinking in terms of when you need to close them up, etc. Okay, I want to thank you, everybody. We've come to the end of proceedings. I want to thank the panel. Vali, Day3, Koos, thank you very much. Very informative. Thanks for sharing your knowledge so freely. Much appreciated. It's a pleasure also to work together with all of you. Thanks for coming through for us today and helping us with this webinar. I want to thank the audience. You've been an attentive audience. I hope you got good value out of the webinars. You asked good questions. Thanks for that. Everybody learns through the questions. I want to thank the background team here of Workro, Tia and Marnu for making sure operations run smoothly. And then lastly, again, our sponsors, Standard Bank, for sponsoring the webinars. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed the webinar series, the Symposium webinar series. And if there's popular demand, we can look at doing something similar again in the future. And if so, you're also then welcome to suggest potential topics that we can cover. Thank you very much. Goodbye.